My husband stood before his family and announced he had filed for divorce this morning, branding me a gold digger. He had no idea the Hermes bag I clutched held the deed that saved his parents from eviction and the first ultrasound of the child we had spent 5 years trying to conceive. I stood in the shadows, holding the truth that would leave every face in that room pale. But to understand why, we have to go back to the night it all began. My name is Elena, and at 34 years old, I truly believed I was walking into the happiest night of my life. The wind off Lake Michigan was merciless, whipping snow against the windshield of my rental car as I navigated the winding driveway of the Sterling estate. I had just returned from Seattle after 4 weeks of exhausting, secretive work, clutching a victory that I thought would finally cement my place in this family. My flight had landed early, giving me a 2-hour head start on my scheduled arrival. I wanted to surprise Lucas. I parked away from the main garage, shielding a large tote bag under my coat as I hurried toward the side entrance, the cold biting at my exposed face. I slipped my key into the lock and turned it silently. The heavy door clicked open, and I stepped out of the freezing gale into the warmth of the mudroom. The air inside was thick with the scent of fresh pine, cinnamon, and the expensive beeswax polish my mother-in-law, Margaret, insisted the maids use on the banisters. From the drawing room down the hall, I could hear the smooth, complex notes of a vintage jazz record playing, overlaid with the clinking of crystal and the murmur of voices. It was the picture of a perfect Christmas Eve, the kind the Sterlings prided themselves on, even as their dynasty quietly crumbled behind the scenes. I kicked off my snow boots, moving softly in my wool socks, eager to see the look on my husband's face when I revealed the contents of the envelope pressed against my chest. But as I neared the archway that separated the servants' corridor from the main living area, I froze. The voice I heard was Lucas, but it was not the voice of the man I loved. It was jagged, loud, and dripping with venom. He was shouting at his parents. He told them he knew everything. He said he was done playing the fool while his wife ran around the country making a mockery of his name. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Lucas was telling them that I was sleeping with Julian Blackwood. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Julian was 65 years old, eccentric, and my most important client, a man who demanded absolute discretion in his dealings. To Lucas, however, he was just the man paying for my betrayal. I listened in horror as my husband laid out his evidence with the confidence of a prosecutor. He spoke of the massive wire transfers hitting my private account, the late-night phone calls I took in locked bathrooms, and my convenient disappearance to Seattle right when Julian was rumored to be acquiring a new collection there. Then came the sentence that severed my life into before and after. Lucas announced that he had gone to the courthouse that very morning. He had filed for divorce. He told his mother he had already hired a private investigator to intercept me the moment I walked through the front door. He wanted to serve me the papers in front of everyone, to humiliate me and watch me crumble when I realized my access to the Sterling fortune was cut off. I waited for someone to defend me. Instead, I heard the sharp, cruel laugh of Bella, his sister. She said she always knew a girl from my background could never be trusted around real wealth. Margaret joined in, her tone smooth and dismissive, agreeing that my nature was inherently greedy and that they were lucky to be rid of me before I caused more damage. I stood paralyzed in the shadows of the hallway, the festive jazz music feeling like a grotesque soundtrack to my execution. My hand tightened around the handle of my Hermes bag until my knuckles turned white. Inside that bag were not illicit love letters or jewelry from a lover. It held a stack of medical records from the Hope Center and bank certifications proving that every cent of those transfers had gone to secretly buying back the bad debt that was drowning this family. I looked down at the dark oak floorboards, my vision blurring as the first hot tear escaped and splashed against the wood. I stepped back into the mudroom, my movements precise and silent. If I walked into that drawing room now, emotional and ambushed, I would be the hysterical wife pleading her innocence to a jury that had already delivered its verdict. I would not give them that satisfaction. I put my boots back on, my hands trembling not from cold, but from a rage so pure it felt like it was rewriting my DNA. I slipped out the side door, leaving the warmth of the lie behind me, and climbed back into my rental car. The engine roared to life, and I reversed down the driveway before the private investigator Lucas had hired could even spot my headlights. The drive to downtown Chicago was a battle against the elements. The blizzard had turned the highway into a sheet of ice, but I drove with a recklessness that frightened me. I needed the anonymity of the city. I pulled up to the Drake Hotel, handing my keys to the valet with a robotic nod, and booked a suite for an indefinite stay. My credit card, thankfully, was still my own. The moment I closed the heavy door of my room, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text from Lucas. "Come home. We need to talk." The casual, almost bored tone of the message made bile rise in my throat. He was acting as if nothing had happened, baiting the trap, waiting for me to walk in so he could spring his ambush. I threw the phone onto the king-sized bed with enough force that it bounced off the mattress and hit the floor. I walked into the bathroom and gripped the edges of the marble sink, staring at my reflection. The woman staring back was unrecognizable. My skin was pale and drawn, dark circles etched deep under my eyes. I looked like a woman who was falling apart, and perhaps physically. My body was a map of bruises from the daily hormone injections I had been administering to myself in airport bathrooms and hotel suites for the last month. But beneath the exhaustion, my eyes were burning. They were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a predator who had just realized she was being hunted. For the last 4 weeks, while Lucas imagined I was in Julian Blackwood's bed, I had been in boardrooms and bank vaults. I had not been sleeping with a billionaire. I had been begging him. I had leveraged every ounce of my professional reputation to convince Julian to front the capital needed to save Lucas's company from a hostile takeover he didn't even know was happening. I had spent my nights analyzing spreadsheets, not drinking champagne. I picked up the hotel room phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Julian answered on the first ring. I told him everything. I told him about the divorce filing, the accusations, and the humiliation waiting for me at the Sterling estate. Julian was silent for a moment, and then his voice exploded with a fury that rivaled the storm outside. He offered to send his entire legal team to destroy Lucas by morning. He wanted to make a public statement. He wanted to crush the Sterlings immediately. I told him no. I thanked him, but I refused. This was not a business transaction anymore. This was personal. I needed to be the one to pull the trigger. I asked Julian to trust me, to wait for my signal. I sat at the desk in the corner of the room and took out a piece of hotel stationery. My hands were steady now. I began to make a list. Item 1 was the medical records from the fertility clinic. Item 2 was the bank transfer receipts. Item 3 was a detailed timeline of every hour I had spent away. I looked at the calendar. I would not respond to the divorce papers yet. I would not answer Lucas's calls. I would vanish. I decided right then that I would give him 3 weeks of absolute silence. Let him stew in his victory. Let him wonder where I was. I would let his anxiety build until it was a physical weight. And then, when he felt safe, I would return. The days following Christmas were a haze of enforced calm. I spent the first 48 hours in my hotel suite simply trying to lower my heart rate. My obstetrician, whom I visited under an assumed name at a clinic on the north side, was blunt with me. She told me that at 10 weeks, the pregnancy was viable but fragile, and that the levels of cortisol flooding my system were a direct threat to the life growing inside me. She prescribed bed rest and disconnectedness, but I could only promise her the latter. I spent long hours staring at the ceiling, remembering the last year of my marriage with a clarity that hurt more than the betrayal itself. I thought about Lucas's coldness, the way he would roll his eyes when I came home late, making snide remarks about how I was married to my job. He had called me ambitious as if it were a slur. He never knew that every extra hour I put in, every flight I took, was to generate the liquidity needed to plug the holes in the Sterling family trust. I had been exhausting myself to keep him afloat, and he had hated me for it. My phone became a toxic object. I turned it on once a day to download the voicemails for my lawyer, never listening to them live. Lucas's tone shifted with a predictability that was almost pathetic. The first few messages were feigned concern, asking where I was and telling me to stop being dramatic. Then, they curdled into anger. He left 3 voicemails in one night, slurring his words, screaming that he knew I was with Julian, that I was probably laughing at him in some penthouse while spending his money. The projection was so strong it was nearly suffocating. By the 4th day, I stopped crying. I rented a small, nondescript office space in the Loop, far away from the art district where anyone might recognize me. I set up a secure server and began to work, not as a wife, but as the forensic auditor I had been trained to be. I remotely accessed the shared files of our family accounts, the ones Lucas thought were too complex for me to understand. I also hired a private investigator of my own, a former federal agent named Vance who charged $500 an hour and asked 0 questions. I needed to know why. Why the sudden, explosive accusation? Why the rush to divorce on Christmas Eve? Vance met me in my temporary office 3 days later. He placed a thick file on the metal desk. The narrative I had built in my head that Lucas was simply paranoid or influenced by his poisonous mother shattered instantly. The truth was far more pedestrian and far more disgusting. Lucas was drowning. The file revealed a gambling addiction that had spiraled out of control 18 months ago. He had lost nearly $2 million at underground tables in Macau and Las Vegas, losses he had tried to cover with high-risk venture capital loans that had all defaulted. He wasn't divorcing me because he thought I was cheating. He was divorcing me to preemptively seize my assets before his creditors came for the house. He needed to paint me as the villain, the adulterer, so he could claim a larger share of the marital assets in court and invalidate the prenup based on a morality clause. But the knife twisted deeper. Vance had found texts between Lucas and his sister, Bella. In them, Lucas admitted that he couldn't stand looking at me anymore. He wrote that my success made him feel small. He hated that I was the one fixing the problems he created. He hated that I was respected in circles where he was just seen as a trust fund baby. I sat back in my chair, feeling a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with morning sickness. My husband did not hate me because he loved me too much to share me. He hated me because my competence highlighted his failure. He had destroyed our marriage not out of passion, but out of an inferiority complex so vast it had consumed his morality. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. The last lingering shred of guilt I felt for leaving him in the dark about the pregnancy evaporated. I was not just fighting for my reputation anymore. I was fighting to keep my child away from a man who would burn down his own house just to feel like the king of the ashes. I walked into the main branch of the First National Bank at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that acted as armor against the world. The meeting with the senior portfolio manager was brief and clinical. I did not need sympathy. I needed paper. I needed the certified cash flow statements that would serve as the autopsy report of my marriage. When I walked out 40 minutes later, I held a thick manila envelope that weighed less than a pound but contained enough gravity to crush the entire Sterling legacy. I drove to my temporary office and spread the documents across the table, engaging in a forensic reconstruction of the last 6 months. To Lucas, the numbers on his screen had been evidence of betrayal. To anyone with a basic understanding of accounting, they were a desperate rescue mission. I lined up the dates. The large wire transfer that Lucas had screamed about on Christmas Eve, $350,000 from the Blackwood Trust, was not an allowance for a mistress. It was the down payment for a collection of rare mid-century lithographs I had personally owned and sold to Julian to cover Lucas's margin calls. I pulled up the email archives next. Lucas had cited my frequent dinners with Julian as proof of infidelity. I printed out every single calendar invite and correspondence. Subject lines read contract review, liquidation strategy, and asset valuation. Every single meeting note confirmed the presence of a third party, either Julian's lead counsel, his personal assistant, or the gallery curator acting as a witness. There were no whispered sweet nothings, only arguments about valuation and escrow periods. I was not laughing over wine with Julian. I was fighting him for every percentage point to ensure Lucas did not lose his company. Then came the piece of evidence that turned my stomach. I opened the file regarding the Sterling family estate in Lake Forest. Lucas had always boasted that the house was free and clear, a symbol of his family's enduring wealth. The document in front of me proved that was a lie. 6 months ago, in a panic over his gambling debts, Lucas had forged his father's signature to take out a high-interest second mortgage on the property. He had leveraged his parents' roof to pay for his mistakes. The document underneath it was the redemption certificate. I had used the remaining proceeds from the sale of my art collection to anonymously purchase that debt from the predatory lender 2 weeks ago. Technically, Lucas's parents were no longer indebted to the bank. They were indebted to me. I arranged the papers in strict chronological order. On the left, the timeline of Lucas's financial hemorrhage, the failed investments, the casino withdrawals, the secret loans. On the right, the timeline of my intervention, the asset sales, the negotiations with Julian, the quiet payoffs to keep the wolves from the door. Looking at the completed timeline, the tragic irony became clear. Lucas had felt emasculated not because I was cheating, but because on some subconscious level, he knew I was the only thing holding his reality together. I had protected him too well. I had hidden the mess so effectively that he had the luxury of inventing a fantasy where he was the victim. By shielding him from the consequences of his own incompetence, I had turned him into a monster who believed he was a king. I placed the mortgage deed at the top of the stack. This was no longer just a divorce case. It was a lesson in accountability. And I was about to be a very strict teacher. The waiting room of the Hope Center smelled of antiseptic and desperate prayers, a scent that had become woven into my clothes over the last 6 months. I sat in the high-backed chair, waiting for the receptionist to hand over the physical copies of my medical file. When she finally slid the thick folder across the counter, I felt a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with the winter coat I was wearing. This file was the chronicle of my physical torture, the detailed log of every invasive procedure I had endured to give Lucas the one thing he claimed he wanted most. I opened the folder to the dates Lucas had circled in red ink on the calendar he threw at me. He called these the nights of my betrayal. He imagined I was in a penthouse suite with Julian, wrapped in silk sheets. The reality was so starkly different it was almost laughable. On those nights, I was lying in a recovery bed in this very building, groggy from anesthesia after painful egg retrieval surgeries. I had stayed overnight for observation because my hormone levels were dangerously high, risking ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. I had hidden this from Lucas because I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to present him with a positive pregnancy test and a solved financial crisis at the same time, a double miracle to fix our broken home. Julian Blackwood had been the only soul I trusted with this secret. He had arranged for the billing to be discreet, routing the payments through his charitable foundation so that the drain on our accounts wouldn't alert Lucas. It was a kindness that Lucas, in his paranoia, had twisted into something sordid. I looked at the billing statement where the name Hope Center appeared. Lucas had screamed that it sounded like a boutique hotel or a spa where I met my lover. He never bothered to Google the name. If he had, he would have seen it was a fertility clinic, not a romantic getaway. Dr. Evans called me back for my consultation. She dimmed the lights and applied the cold gel to my abdomen. When the rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of the heartbeat filled the small room, the tears I had been holding back finally fell. There, on the monitor, was the tiny, flickering shape of the life I was fighting for. It was 10 weeks along, resilient and strong, completely unaware of the war waging outside the womb. This was the only thing keeping me upright. I wasn't just fighting for my reputation anymore. I was fighting for this heartbeat. After the appointment, Dr. Evans looked at me with serious eyes. She warned me that my blood pressure was creeping up. She told me that for the sake of the pregnancy, I needed to eliminate all sources of high stress. I almost laughed in her face. How could I tell her that the only way to eliminate my stress was to destroy the father of her patient? I nodded and took the prescription for extra vitamins, promising to take it easy. I sat in my car in the parking lot and pulled out a piece of cream-colored stationery. My hand shook slightly as I uncapped my pen. I wrote a letter to the child growing inside me. I promised this baby that I would be strong enough for both parents. I promised that their father's weakness would not become their burden. I folded the letter carefully. Then, I took a deep red velvet box from my bag. It was originally meant for a pair of diamond cufflinks I had planned to give Lucas for Christmas. I emptied the box and instead placed the positive pregnancy tests inside, arranging them next to the glossy black and white ultrasound photo I had just received. I snapped the lid shut. The box no longer held a gift for a husband. It held the evidence that would break him. Evelyn Sharp's office on the 45th floor of the Willis Tower was entirely glass and chrome, designed to make anyone sitting on the other side of her desk feel small. I, however, did not feel small. I felt like a loaded weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Evelyn was the most feared divorce attorney in Chicago, a woman known for turning unfaithful husbands into cautionary tales. She adjusted her spectacles and flipped through the binder I had assembled, her expression unreadable. She studied the mortgage redemption certificate, the forensic accounting of Lucas's gambling debts, and finally, the timeline of my IVF treatments. She closed the file with a heavy thud and looked me dead in the eye. She told me that I would not just win this case. She said I would bury him. We spent the next 2 hours drafting a new settlement agreement. The original terms Lucas had proposed were insulting, offering me a pittance while claiming I was at fault. The document we created was a declaration of war. I was demanding immediate repayment of every single dollar I had poured into the Sterling family estate. I wanted the $200,000 from my art sale returned with interest. I wanted the $50,000 I had paid to silence his bookies. We also added a scorched earth defamation clause. If Lucas or his family dared to repeat the lie about my affair with Julian to the press or any business associates, the penalty would bankrupt them within a week. Evelyn tapped her pen against the desk. She advised me to let her send the papers via a process server. She argued that it was cleaner and safer, and it kept me out of the line of fire. I shook my head. I told her that a process server was too impersonal for the magnitude of what they had done to me. I needed them to see the truth. I needed to see their faces when the walls closed in. They needed to see it with their own eyes. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend who had always secretly despised Bella Sterling. She sent me a screenshot of a digital invitation. The Sterlings were hosting a party this coming Saturday night. They were calling it a freedom party to celebrate Lucas's return to bachelorhood. The audacity of it made my blood boil. They were celebrating the end of a marriage they had actively sabotaged, dancing on the grave of a relationship I had sacrificed my health to save. The date of the party marked exactly 3 weeks since Christmas Eve. The timing was surgical. I sat in my car and dialed Julian Blackwood. He answered on the second ring. I asked him if he had received an invitation to the Sterling estate for the weekend. He laughed a dry, humorless laugh. He told me that Margaret Sterling had called his office personally, inviting him as a guest of honor. In their twisted logic, they believed that since I was out of the picture, they could court Julian directly for his business, completely ignoring the fact that they had accused him of sleeping with their daughter-in-law. They were desperate for his capital and assumed his presence would validate Lucas's social standing. I told Julian to accept the invitation. I told him to go and let them fawn over him. I asked him to be the bait. He agreed without hesitation, his voice low and grim. He said the stage was set. I hung up the phone and looked at the Chicago skyline. They wanted a show. I was going to give them a finale they would never forget. While I was preparing specifically for my return, inside the Sterling household, the atmosphere had become suffocatingly triumphant. The head housekeeper, who had polished the silver in that house for 20 years, watched in silence as Lucas Sterling strutted through the hallways like a rooster who believed he commanded the sun to rise. Since that terrible Christmas Eve, Lucas had been living in a state of manic delusion. His mother, Margaret, had not stopped crowing about how they finally cut out the cancer that was eating away at their family fortune. She was talking, of course, about me. They toasted to it every night with vintage scotch they could not afford, blissfully unaware that the very floorboards beneath their feet had already changed owners. Lucas bragged to his gambling buddies that the universe had corrected itself the moment he kicked his wife out. The collection agencies had suddenly gone silent. The threatening letters from the bank had stopped. To Lucas, this silence was proof that he was untouchable. He did not have the sense to realize that banks do not forget debts. They only go quiet when the debt has been sold to a new, more patient owner. The preparations for the upcoming party were obscene. Margaret had ordered cases of imported champagne and hired a catering crew that cost a fortune. They were calling it a freedom party, curated to introduce Lucas as the most eligible bachelor in Chicago. But to the staff watching them arrange thousands of white orchids, it felt like they were decorating a sinking ship. Yet, despite his bravado, cracks appeared in Lucas's armor when he thought no one was watching. He was obsessed with his phone, checking the screen every 3 minutes, waiting for me to call. He wanted me to beg. He wanted to hear me pleading to be let back into the sanctuary of the Sterling name. But my silence was absolute, and it was driving him mad. On the morning of the party, the house buzzed with frantic energy. Lucas stood before the hallway mirror, adjusting his bow tie. He told his mother that by midnight, everyone would know he was back on top. He was right about one thing. By midnight, everyone would know exactly who Lucas Sterling was, but it would not be the story he was prepared to tell. I stood before the full-length mirror in my hotel suite, applying a shade of crimson lipstick that felt less like makeup and more like war paint. My reflection showed a woman I barely recognized from the sobbing mess of 3 weeks ago. I was wearing a black silk gown, high-necked and long-sleeved, tailored with architectural precision. It was elegant, severe, and most importantly, cut to drape loosely over my waist, concealing the slight curve of my 11-week pregnancy. I placed a hand on my stomach for a brief second, a silent reassurance to the life inside, before picking up the heavy leather portfolio from the bed. Inside were the papers that would dismantle the Sterling dynasty. I drove the rented Porsche 911 toward the suburbs, the engine purring with a lethal sort of power beneath me. The roads were clear of snow tonight, the sky a vast, indifferent black. I felt a strange, icy calm settling over my skin. It was the feeling of a soldier walking onto a battlefield where the enemy had already surrendered. They just didn't know it yet. As I pulled into the winding driveway of the Sterling estate, I saw the house ablaze with light. It looked like a castle from a fairy tale, but I knew it was a house of cards waiting for a breeze. I parked the car directly in front of the main entrance, ignoring the valet who rushed forward to open my door. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a text from Julian Blackwood. The message was short. "The stage is ready. Kid." I took a deep breath, smelling the cold winter air one last time before stepping into the suffocating warmth of the lie. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The sound of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom, mixed with the hum of expensive conversation and the clinking of crystal. I began to walk. My heels struck the marble floor with a rhythmic, deliberate cadence click, click, click. It was a sound that demanded attention. As I reached the archway of the main hall, the chatter began to die down. It started as a ripple near the door and spread like a wave until the entire room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. All eyes were on me. I stood tall, my chin lifted, letting them look. Lucas was standing near the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked the part of the triumphant bachelor, flushed and smiling, until his eyes landed on me. The color drained from his face, replaced instantly by a flush of drunken anger. He set his glass down on the mantel with a hard clatter and stormed toward me, his gait slightly unsteady. "You," he spat, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "You have the nerve to show your face here after everything you did." The crowd parted instinctively, forming a wide circle around us. This was the drama they secretly craved, the scandal that would feed their gossip for months. Margaret Sterling materialized from the crowd, her face twisted into a mask of aristocratic disdain. She looked as if she smelled something rotting. "Get out!" Margaret screeched, pointing a manicured finger at the door. "Security, remove this woman from my house immediately. She has no business here." Two uniformed guards stepped forward, but before they could reach me, a deep, booming voice cut through the tension. "Stand down!" Julian Blackwood stepped out from the circle of guests. He was the man the Sterlings had spent the entire evening fawning over, the trophy guest they believed validated their social standing. He walked over and stood beside me, not as a lover, but as a formidable wall of protection. He looked at Margaret with eyes that were cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "Let her speak," Julian commanded. It was not a request. It was an order from a man who owned half the city. Margaret froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Lucas looked between me and Julian, his confusion morphing into a sneer. "Oh, I see." Lucas laughed bitterly, gesturing between us. "You brought him here to humiliate me, is that it?" I looked at my husband. I saw the sweat on his brow, the fear behind his arrogance, and the utter smallness of his soul. I didn't feel hate anymore. I just felt the weight of the portfolio in my hand. I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that didn't reach my eyes. "I am not here to stay, Lucas," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I came to return what you gave me on Christmas Eve, and to give you the truth that you do not deserve to know." So I walked past him to the main banquet table, the heels of my shoes sinking into the plush carpet. The tower of champagne glasses shimmered under the chandelier, a monument to a celebration that was about to turn into a funeral. I placed my Hermes bag on the white tablecloth. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. I reached inside and pulled out the portfolio containing the first document, a thick stack of legal papers bound in blue. I held it up so the light caught the embossed seal of the bank. "You accused me of trying to steal your family fortune, Lucas," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room. "But there was no fortune left to steal. This house, the floor you are standing on, was foreclosed by the bank 30 days ago. Your parents missed 6 mortgage payments. I am the one who bought the title back this morning." I tossed the deed onto the table. It slid across the linen and stopped right in front of Margaret. Her face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray as she recognized the foreclosure stamp. She reached for the table edge to steady herself, her eyes wide with disbelief. I did not give them time to breathe. I pulled out the second file, the financial records I had spent weeks compiling. "And the money?" I asked, looking directly at Lucas. "The $350,000 you saw in the transfers. You told everyone I was selling my body to Julian. I was not selling myself. Lucas, I was selling my art collection. The paintings I bought before I met you. I sold every single one of them to pay off the gambling debts you hid in the offshore accounts." I thrust the papers into his chest. He scrambled to catch them, his hands shaking so badly the pages rattled. He looked down. He saw the names of the loan sharks and the casinos, and next to them, the stamps that read, "Paid in full." "I did not sleep with your wife, Lucas," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped forward, towering over my husband. "I helped her liquidate her assets to clean up the mess you made. I was not her lover. I was her banker." Lucas looked up from the papers, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying comprehension. But I was not finished. I reached into the bag one last time and pulled out the red velvet box. It looked like a jewelry case, the kind that might hold a diamond necklace. I opened it slowly and took out the glossy black and white photograph. I placed it gently on top of the pile of debt records. "You asked where I went at night," I said, my voice finally trembling, not with fear, but with the sheer magnitude of the tragedy. "You saw the bills from the Hope Center and called it a hotel. It is not a hotel, Lucas. It is a fertility clinic." I pointed to the grainy image of the fetus. "I went there 3 times a week for injections. I endured the pain and the hormones because we have been trying for 5 years. That is our child, Lucas, 10 weeks old." The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. No one moved. No one breathed. Lucas stared at the ultrasound photo. His eyes widened, darting from the image to my stomach, hidden beneath the black silk. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The rage vanished from his face, and in its place, a tsunami of regret crashed over him, drowning him right there in front of the people he had tried so hard to impress. Lucas hit his knees with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the floorboards. It was not a graceful descent, but a collapse, as if his legs had simply decided they could no longer support the crushing weight of his conscience. He reached out, his fingers grasping desperately for the hem of my black silk dress, his face streaked with sweat and tears. He started babbling, a stream of disjointed apologies, begging me to forgive him, swearing he did not know, promising he would make it right if I just gave him one more chance. The silence in the ballroom finally broke. The guests, the elite of Chicago who had come to celebrate Lucas's freedom, began to murmur. I could hear the rustle of expensive fabric and the click of heels on marble as people turned away, unable or unwilling to watch the total disintegration of the Sterling family. They filed out rapidly, casting looks of pity and disgust at the man sobbing on the floor. Margaret stood frozen near the champagne tower, looking like a wax statue that had cracked down the center. Her empire was gone, dismantled by the very woman she had spent years trying to break. I took a deliberate step back, pulling my dress from Lucas's grip. I looked down at him. I expected to feel triumph. I expected to feel the burning satisfaction of vengeance that I had nursed for 3 weeks in that lonely hotel room. But as I looked at the man I had married, the man I had nearly bankrupted myself to save, I felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. He looked so small. I spoke to him one last time. "You filed for divorce because you thought I was a traitor," I said, my voice calm and final. "I accept that divorce, Lucas, not because I betrayed you, but because you never believed in me. You let your insecurity destroy the only person who was actually fighting for you." He looked up, his eyes red and pleading. He tried to say my name, tried to bring up the baby, but I cut him off. "There is no us," I told him, "and there is no starting over in this house. As the legal owner of this property, I am informing you that it will be listed for sale on Monday morning to recoup my losses. You and your parents have 30 days to vacate the premises." I turned my back on him. It was the hardest and easiest thing I have ever done. I felt Julian's hand on my elbow, guiding me through the dispersing crowd, a silent sentinel ensuring no one dared to stop me. Behind me, I heard Lucas scream my name, a raw, broken sound that echoed off the high ceilings. It was the sound of a man realizing he had thrown away a diamond because he thought it was glass. I did not pause. I did not flinch. I kept walking, the sound of his despair fading with every step I took toward the heavy oak doors. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. I climbed into the driver's seat of the Porsche, the leather cold against my skin. Julian gave me a respectful nod from the curb, a final salute to a battle won, before turning to his own car. I shut the door, sealing myself inside the quiet sanctuary of the vehicle. I placed my hand gently over my stomach, beneath the layers of silk and grief. There was a future waiting to happen. We are going to be okay. I whispered to the darkness. We are going to be just fine. I started the engine and pulled away from the mansion that was already dissolving into chaos in my rearview mirror. To the east, over the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan, the sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. The storm had passed. The sun was rising on a cold, clear morning in Chicago, and for the first time in a long time, the road ahead belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from to share your thoughts with me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people.